Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time around, it's Science Fiction Saturday once more, and we're hitting the 1950s with science fiction. And the theme of these two movies is Cold War anti-communist propaganda and paranoia. It's moral panics, it's fear of the other, it's all of the things we know and love about 1950s science fiction. So let's get started with the more recent of the two. 1957's The 27th Day, directed by William Asher, who went on to direct Bewitched and was actually the creative engine of Bewitched. He was married to Elizabeth Montgomery. William Asher, he'd done a whole bunch of TV stuff in the early 1950s and occasionally dipped into movies. He made more movies later on. He directed interesting films like Johnny Cool. But The 27th Day, which was based on a novel and has a lot of interesting concepts in it. It stars Gene Barry, Valerie French, George Vosovec and Arnold Moss. And if you've seen it, particularly if you saw it as a kid, the mind-blowing concepts may have grabbed you. The story is pretty simple and very old school as far as science fiction itself is concerned. 5 people from across the world are kidnapped by an alien who takes them up into his spaceship. He starts traveling near the speed of light, so there's a time dilation effect. So there's not going to be much time between when they're kidnapped and when they're brought back to Earth. He gives each of them a little box with 3 capsules in it and tells them that those capsules can destroy any human life within a 3,000-mile diameter. He and his species are going to wait 27 days after the people are put back to Earth to see whether the human race destroys itself, and his race, whose sun is going nova, will be able to come to Earth with a kind of infrastructure in place and take over the planet. So the 5 people are pretty simple. There's a journalist played by Gene Barry. There's an English woman played by Valerie French, a scientist from sort of Eastern Europe, played by George Vosovec. There's a Chinese woman called Su Tam, played by Maria Xian, who is very underwritten. And there's a Russian soldier called Ivan, played by Azamat Janti. Of course, the people who aren't Western get very underwritten and get kind of marginalised in the narrative, but that's to be expected for a 1950s American science fiction movie. So all 5 of them go back to Earth and they're all pretty stunned by this thing. They've been kidnapped by an alien. They've got the power to destroy the world in the palm of their hands. The journalist, played by Gene Barry, and the English woman, played by Valerie French, she flies to Los Angeles to meet him, and they hole up inside a race course out of season. There's a little bit of a bunk area where they bunk down and hide from the security guards. The scientist, played by George Vosovec, is coming to America anyway to talk to the government and to do some lectures, which is kind of convenient. Meanwhile, the young Chinese woman, whose village has just been destroyed by the Chinese communists, puts her capsule box in front of a statue of Buddha and commits suicide. The Russian soldier, however, has a rougher time of it. A little while after they get back to Earth, the alien does a worldwide broadcast doxing them, telling everybody on Earth who they are and which city they live in, and thereby causing them a lot of hassles. Helen Johnson hiding in the race course. The Chinese woman is out of the picture. The scientist is liaising with the American government and telling them what he knows, but not giving them access to his capsules. And Ivan, the Russian guy, is interrogated and tortured by his own government, who wants him to help them destroy the Western world. Now, I'm going to do spoilers in both of these movies because to get to the guts of them, I've got to do that. Now, they're movies that are over 60 years old, so if I do spoilers, please don't complain about it. I'm kind of unraveling the nature of what's behind these movies and the cultural context in which they were made. Of the 2 movies, The 27th Day is the more accomplished. It moves along at a nice pace. The alien spaceship is very minimalist. The science fictional aspects of it talk to culture in an interesting way. And it brings up those issues of what would you do if you had the ultimate power of life and death over pretty much half of the world in the palm of your hand? How would you handle that? What would you do with it? Eve, the English woman, has the right idea. She chucks her box into the ocean. It's a solution that Christopher Nolan borrowed for The Dark Knight, where you have the 2 ferries with the bombs on it, and Tiny Lister's character chucks the bomb out the window of the ferry. Nice little callback to The 27th Day by Christopher Nolan. But Jonathan doesn't do that, and the scientist doesn't do that, and Ivan's not allowed to do that. So things get very, very tense. The government decides to test one of the capsules that they have, because they've got 2 lots of capsules, and they find a part of the ocean where there's no people for 3,000 kilometers. And another one of their scientists decides he's going to be the guinea pig, gives himself a lethal dose of radiation, so he's going to die anyway. And they put him on a little raft just inside the radius of that 3,000 kilometers. The scientist, played by George Vosovec, gives the latitude and longitude. The capsule disappears from his hand, and the other scientist disintegrates. So they know the capsules work. And again, that intensifies things. What do you do? And they kind of know that the Soviet people are going to wait to the last minute of the 27 days and zap all of North America at the very last second, so there's no chance of retaliation. They announce a threat where they want all US forces to withdraw to continental United States, because that's what they need to do to win. And the US decides to do that while they're trying to work out a solution to this dilemma. It's mutual assured destruction, but at a microscopic level. Every human being within the radius of these capsules is going to die. Now, the scientist, whose name is Klaus Beckner, sees some inscriptions on the capsules and decides he's going to translate them. And there's something that the aliens said that makes him think that there's something up. Now, here's where the spoilers come in. He finds a way to kind of hack the capsules. And meanwhile, Ivan tries to stop the general in charge from launching the capsules against America. He runs at the general, he's shot by his own people, and because he dies, his capsules become inert. Meanwhile, the scientist Beckner launches the capsules with the hacking done, and the capsules kill every known enemy of human freedom. The world all comes together and does a kumbaya, and they ask the aliens, if you guys need the planet, we're willing to help you out. We're going to give you some land. We're going to try to help you out. And the aliens' voice comes over and tells them that they're going to join a federation of thousands of civilizations across the stars, and everything is going to be hunky-dory. Here's the issue. When they're talking about every known enemy of human freedom, that's a very broad term. That's a very, very broad term. And it makes me wonder, did J. Edgar Hoover die? Did all the politicians south of the Mason-Dixon line die? Did all the white apartheid people in South Africa die? Did all of the racists in Australia die? Did all of the racists in China and everywhere else die? Enemies of human freedom is a very, very broad term. And were you to stay true to the premise of this movie, there'd be a lot of dead people. Now, I grew up in Australia in the 1960s, and we had incredible amounts of racist people where I lived. It took a while for me to unlearn that kind of racism as a child, and I'm sure many of us have gone through that process. And also, does human freedom include the freedom for people to be gay, or lesbian, or trans, or bi, or asexual, or intersexual? It's a very, very broad term, and it plays into that goodies versus baddies paranoia that the West had against the communists, and the communists had against the West. Meanwhile, the socialist countries in Scandinavia just went on to invent things like IKEA and Nokia and Lego and those really nice meatballs you get at IKEA. From a modern point of view, this movie's political axis is childlike. It's goodies versus baddies. It's the kind of axis that extreme right-wing politicians want to bring back into the discourse we have. We live in a very, very complex world, and that complexity allows for nuance. I mean, there are things like, if you want to look at modern stuff, Putin killing Navalny. Now, killing your political enemies is something that's a tradition in Russia. But on the other hand, Alexei Navalny was also a racist, even though he was Putin's opposition in politics and ended up being put into essentially gulag in Siberia, and he died there by whatever means. He's still a racist. He's still not the sort of person you want to be stuck on a desert island with. You don't want him to hold your wallet while you go swimming. So that kind of complexity and that kind of nuance is totally missing from these kind of didactic movies. Yes, The 27th Day is a lot of fun. Gene Barry is an incredibly personable actor. Valerie French is good in it. George Vosovec's good in it. And even people like the bad guys, there's a really nasty Soviet general played by Stefan Schnabel, who does a really good job of his stuff. And we even see a little cameo by Paul Frees playing a newscaster. Paul Frees was one of the great voiceover artists of the middle part of the 20th century. And we also get a guy who turned up in a lot of science fiction movies in the 1950s, Paul Birch, playing an admiral who takes them out to do the tests on the capsules. So it's a very accomplished film. It was made by Columbia Pictures. It wasn't made for a lot of money, but it's good, solid science fiction until that little thing at the end, which, yes, it ties up the plot, but it's simplistic and to be honest, it's stupid. And it's the easiest path to take to resolve the plot. There could have been another way they could have done it. There could have been several other ways. But that bit about every known enemy of human freedom being killed. What about the ones that aren't known? What about the secret ones? What about the crypto-fascists lurking amongst every civilization on the earth? Simplistic as hell, but it's still entertaining. It still moves along. It still has those questions about what would you do in this situation. But that one thing at the end messes up the landing, and I'm disappointed in that, while the rest of the movie is a very accomplished piece of 1950s science fiction. That then takes me to the second film. A totally insane movie from 1952 called Red Planet Mars, which stars Peter Graves and Andrea King, and it is one of those movies that does a bait and switch on the audience in a way that I find egregious and infuriating. And I didn't quite throw anything at the screen, but I did do a head desk. It's a bad science fiction movie because it has a stupid concept at the heart of it. Peter Graves, who is one of the most wooden actors to ever have a gig, plays Chris Cronin, a scientist who discovers a way to send a signal to Mars by radio. He actually pinched the idea from a Nazi scientist called Fritz Kolder, whom he doesn't know has a secret lab of his own in the Peruvian Andes, where he can hear the signals that Chris is sending to Mars. Now, this Nazi scientist is being financed by the Russian communists, of course, and he's drinking his way through several crates of champagne while he monitors the signals that Chris is sending to Mars. Chris communicates with the Martians using Pi as the initial communication handshake, and they start passing signals between each other, and he finds out some interesting things about Mars. Now, the movie's set several years into the future from 1952, so he's got a flat screen TV up on the wall of his living room. There's a few other technological things that are a little more advanced, and they find out some weird things about Mars. For a start, lifespan on Mars is 300 years, and that gets announced publicly, and people are hanging off these signals from Mars. It's all over all of the news media, and the moment they find out the people on Mars, or creatures on Mars, live to be 300 years, there's a moral panic on the Earth, and insurance companies collapse and start not honouring their annuities because they're going to have to pay out on retirement annuities for potentially over 200 years. So the insurance industry instantly collapses because the creatures on Mars live to be 300 years. There are all of these moral panics and social panics that occur as the information about what happens on Mars is leaked. They find out that the Martians have advanced energy generation capabilities. So the coal industry collapses in anticipation of the Martians giving human beings a way to not use coal power anymore. From our point of view, that's a good thing. From the point of view of 1950s American economics, it's considered a bad one. The coal industry collapses, the mines close, all of the miners get unemployed. There are strikes, there are protests, there are all sorts of things. The steel industry collapses because there's no coal to melt the steel, and there's an economic collapse almost instantly in America, all because of the instinctive knee-jerk reactions they have to the information coming from Mars. Meanwhile, Chris's wife Lynn, played by Andrea King, doesn't want him communicating with Mars because she's scared something bad's going to happen. She's living with the Cold War mutually assured destruction paranoia. They have 2 kids, 2 young boys, and she's decided that ignorance is bliss, and not knowing this stuff is the way to go.
You'll be the next to advance science, and maybe us, right into oblivion.
More information comes from Mars. They find out 1 acre of land on Mars, because of their advanced agricultural techniques, can feed 1,000 people. So the entire agricultural industry collapses in anticipation of that, because the people who made this movie just don't know how economics and industry work. Of course, Chris gets blamed for all this because shoot the messenger. There's a run on the banks, there's a stock market crash, governments fall in France, they have like 7 governments in a week and none of them can hold, and there's all sorts of running around in circles and going crazy. The Martians start sending them a lot of technical data as America's economy and society is collapsing that the Americans don't understand is too advanced for them. The military people in Washington start discussing the possibility of starting a nuclear war to protect America. Yeah, no, don't do that. Bad idea. It's not going to really end well for anybody. You end up with Don Johnson and a telepathic dog in a mudflat. So you don't want to do that. Belatedly, the president orders radio and television and newspaper information about the signals from Mars to not be passed on to the public because he's locking the door after the horse has bolted. Not only is all this madness occurring, but the Martians send a signal which blows everybody's mind. They won't be giving Earth any more data because Earth stopped believing in the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah, the Jesus thing. The loaves and fishes Jesus thing. The president, possibly because of early onset dementia, releases this information to the public, and instantly everybody starts going to church. And they kind of do a little bit of a hand wave by saying that Muslim people and Jewish people are also going to be doing this. And in Russia, everybody starts digging up the Russian Orthodox artifacts that they hid when the communists took over. They put up the artifacts in a little shrine, and then they get machine gunned by the communist government because that's what happens. But there's a groundswell of Russian Orthodox religious belief that overthrows the Soviet Empire, and Russia becomes a religious theocracy. Much better option. Meanwhile, Calder, the drunken Nazi scientist, turns up at Chris and Lynn's house and holds them at gunpoint in their lab and tells them that all of the signals were sent by him and that he is messing with the whole planet to get America's society to collapse because being an ex-Nazi, he didn't like America. Chris and Lynn don't believe him because, of course, they're programmed by their own religion, and they end up blowing up the lab with Calder and themselves in it and become national heroes. And a kind of weird religious theocracy of peace starts across the world. Now, we've got a few things to unpack there. First off, this is a dystopian result. We know what happens when religious nuts take over government. We've seen it happen all sorts of places. It's on the verge of happening in America at the moment. Kind of sort of happened a little bit here in Australia when people like Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison were prime ministers, but it didn't take long term because we're overwhelmingly a secular state. And it's also a dishonest resolution to the plot. You communicated with March, you're finding out all sorts of interesting things, and because of finding out these things, societies start to change rapidly. There's that thing when an advanced society contacts a less advanced society. The less advanced society changes radically simply based on the information given and the products and the other things given by the more advanced society. That's a legitimate concern for science fiction, and any number of science fiction novels and stories have covered that ground. The idea of Jesus Christ going to Mars and helping the Martian civilization, and then having the Martian civilization basically turn into Mormon door knockers for the human race is innately dishonest. You do science fiction, you do science fiction. If you do a religious parable, you do a religious parable. You don't con an audience by saying, this is going to be this kind of movie, and then halfway through, you start making it a different kind of movie with a different kind of result, with a different background. You don't do a science fiction movie where the Earth has started to be invaded by aliens and then having angels rescue the Earth. They're two different kinds of story, and it's dishonest to mix and match them just for your own theological convenience. This movie pisses me off. It had good groundings at the start. It had a good idea. It was telling the idea well. Communicating with aliens starting out with a universal constant like pi is a good idea. It works well, and having that discussion of what is the impact of first contact on human beings when they find out that there are a lot of advances that are going to come down the pipeline, which are going to change the nature of industry, technology, and society. All really good things to address in a narrative film. Them making the aliens a whole bunch of god botherers. That's dishonest, that's crazy, and that is the reason why I hate this movie with a fiery passion. I like honesty in films. I like movies that follow through on their concept and give us something to think about at the end beside how drunk were the people when they made this movie. Red Planet Mars is everything wrong with some 1950s science fiction movies, bringing God into the equation of a science fiction film, unless it's innately about a crisis of faith by a religious person when challenged by irrefutable proof of something different. That's an honest thing. But this movie is crazily dishonest. And having stiff actors like Peter Graves in there only annoyed me more. Now, I recommend you watch the movie anyway, so you can be just as annoyed as I am. I suggest you have a couple of Nerf balls or a Cush ball around so you have something to throw at the screen that is not going to damage your hardware. It's hard for me to say a movie shouldn't exist, but I think this one should be like a lot of racist films of the time. You put up a couple of screens before the movie starts, contextualizing the stupidity you're going to see in the film. If we do that for racism, why don't we do that for religious extremism in cinema? So I'm going to go away and have a nice quiet think about pleasant things after watching this movie. They're the two films I've got for you. 27th Day, which has that one little bit that doesn't work, and Red Planet Mars, which has the second half of it, which doesn't work and annoyed the hell out of me. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Look at some of the playlists and look at some of the other science fiction movies I've covered on the channel. There are literally hundreds of them now. You can also support the channel by donating at the little donation link on the YouTube page for the channel. You can also become a patron at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. Next up, I've got the Monday video, which is the Sunday video if you're on the slow side of the planet. And until then, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies. Watch some 1950s science fiction movies, but buyer beware, there are some of them that really will annoy you. And I'll catch you next time.